Hello everyone, Grandpa Ron here again. Hope you're all well and happy and ready to look into God's inspired Word again. Today we're going to talk about Genesis 11. This is actually the 10th in our series of basic Bible studies. And we're going to keep it basic even though there's a ton of stuff in here we could talk for weeks about, but we're going to keep it basic and hit the high spots. But just as a reminder, in the last lesson there were a lot of genealogies, and we mentioned that they were not all inclusive, but it discussed what happened after Noah got out of the ark and how his sons started to have children, and those children had children, of course, and these generations moved out on their own. Now God had told them to go and multiply and fill the earth, spread out, but we're going to see that they disobeyed God over generations and did not spread out. And we also saw last time, during those genealogies, where it discussed where they eventually did spread out, and we're going to talk about what caused them to spread out in a minute. But there was a phrase that we decided to keep in our memory banks here and remember, and that was that they spread out according to their languages and their nations. And we thought, well, didn't they all speak the same language when they got off the ark? And chapter 11 is a flashback. We had the genealogies, God telling us all these genealogies, how long people lived, who their sons were. But now we're going to flash back and get an explanation of this term division of the languages. So let's go ahead and start with chapter 11 in Genesis, verse 1. Now the whole earth used the same language and the same words. Well, that's what we thought. When they got off the ark, they all used the same language. And it came about in verse 2, as they journeyed east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." And they used brick for stone, and they used tar for mortar. It's an indication of the tremendous intellect that man still had. They knew how to do things. They knew how to make things. And it's not like they just jumped off the ark, went to this land of Shinar and started making bricks. No, the narrative is condensed, so there may have been hundreds of years pass until they got to this place and started to make these bricks. It could have been a pretty significant period of time. We have to keep that in mind. Verse 4, and they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach unto heaven, and let us make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth." Well, this is the opposite of what God had told them to do. He had told them to spread out over the whole earth. But there's a few key words here that tells us what's going on in their minds. And they said, "Come, let us build for ourselves," not for God, not to worship God, and not to show His glory, but let's build for ourselves a city and a tower whose top will reach into the heaven, and let's make for ourselves a name, lest we be scattered abroad. So this is in direct contradiction to what God had told them to do. They're saying, no, we like it here, we're going to stay here, we're going to build for ourselves a name. So let's see what happens. And the Lord, verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the sons of men had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do. And now nothing which they purpose will be impossible for them. So, just like before the flood, the descendants of Adam and Eve, they all had one language. And what did they do? Exactly the opposite of what God told them to do. They rebelled. Their hearts were filled with evil. The earth became a very violent place. And this is what they began to do. And now they've got one language again. That sin nature is driving them once more. And God is saying, they've rebelled against me. They're building this tower to make their own God. They're not spreading out. Any evil thought that they have, they'll now be able to do because of the one language. So, how is God going to fix this? Chapter 7. Come, let us go down there, confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. And this is interesting because it says, come, let us go down there. And that's a hint at the triune Godhead, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Let us go down. That's how important this was to God. The whole Godhead is involved. Verse 8, so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. So you can imagine, everybody wakes up one morning. This was a pretty technical project. You're talking about making bricks, so resources had to be gathered to make the bricks. There were huge numbers of people involved in making them. There was a design to the tower. You had engineers. So there were technical aspects of how the bricks were laid. I mean, it was a pretty technologically advanced project. And everybody wakes up one morning and nobody can understand each other. It's hard to imagine what would happen in all that. And so everybody starts to move away from one another. The little family groups may speak the same language, and they move over here, and another group over here. Clearly, there were dominant groups that were more powerful than others. Probably the most dominant were the ones that stayed right there in Babel. But they were basically forced to spread out. If you won't obey me, then I'll have to take other measures. And God confused their language, and they spread out. It's amazing to think about, because this not only affected language, but by all these different groups moving out across the face of the earth and starting to inbreed in these different pockets. This is where you see all the different racial types start to develop. You know, this group over here, dominant genes start to make certain characteristics common. Over here, it's different characteristics, whether it's color of skin, color of eyes, shape of the head, physical abilities. I mean, this is where all the different racial types came about as well, by all these different language groups moving out and breeding within their own group. So let's see what else happened. Verse 9, therefore its name was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of the whole earth. Man wouldn't obey and do it himself, so the Lord scattered them. Now starting in verse 10, we have genealogy again, and this is descendants of Shem. But we already had the descendants of Shem back in chapter 10. But this is different. This is a more selective list. It's descendants to show the record of the generations of Shem leading to Abram. Because after verse 11, and including the end of verse 11, we're going to see a shift from God's creation, how the world began, the great flood, how people disobeyed God once again. God had to spread them out by confusing the languages. So this was a general history of the whole world and all of mankind. Now we're going to see a shift to the line of Abram, who later was named Abraham. And so the focus of the Bible now is going to be on Abram and Abraham and the agreements, the promises God made to Abraham and his descendants. And so this lineage from verses 10 down to 26 are a selective 10-generation lineage showing how we got to Abram. And I'll just read quickly through here. These are the records of the generations of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and became the father of Arpachshad 2 years after the flood. And Shem lived 500 years after he became the father of Arpachshad, and he had other sons and daughters. And Arpachshad lived 35 years and became the father of Shelah. And Arpachshad lived 403 years after he became the father of Shelah, and he had other sons and daughters. And Shelah lived 30 years and became the father of Eber. And Shelah lived 403 years after he became the father of Eber, and he had other sons and daughters. And Eber lived 34 years and became the father of Peleg. And Eber lived 430 years after he became the father of Peleg, and he had other sons and daughters. And Peleg lived 30 years and became the father of Reu. And Peleg lived 209 years after he became the father of Reu, and he had other sons and daughters. And Reu lived 32 years and became the father of Serug. And Reu lived 207 years after he became the father of Serug, and he had other sons and daughters. And Serug lived 30 years and became the father of Nahor. And Serug lived 200 years after he became the father of Nahor, and he had other sons and daughters. And Nahor lived 29 years and became the father of Terah. And Nahor lived 190 years after he became the father of Terah, and he had other sons and daughters. And Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So here's Abram in verse 26. One thing to notice in these genealogies as people are starting to live shorter lives. Remember Adam over 900, Noah over 900, because he was born before the flood. Then after the flood, we see these ages starting to go down. Now we saw Peleg in verse 16, and to me it kind of gives us a hint of how long it took before they tried to build this Tower of Babel. If you just read down through here, I'm not going to do it, but it seems to me like if you look at the numbers leading up to Peleg, that there had to be at least 400 years, maybe a little longer, before they actually started to build the tower. I'm sure if I did some research and looked at some other commentaries that people have tried to narrow that down, but suffice it to say, the Tower of Babel attempt was hundreds of years after Noah and his original family first got off the ark. Then we have all these people. And another thing to note is Peleg, remember, means division. So this division of the languages probably occurred during Peleg's lifetime. And so we're talking hundreds of years after the ark. That's when the languages were divided. But then even after Peleg, you have more generations with the divided languages before you ever get to Abram. So hundreds more years, in other words. So let's look at the end of the chapter, the family of Abraham. Now these are the records of the generations of Terah. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran became the father of Lot. And Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth, in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nahor took wives for themselves. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Ishka. And Sarai was barren. She had no children at this time in the narrative. And Terah took Abram, his son, and Lot, the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went together from Ur of the Chaldeans in order to enter the land of Canaan. And they went as far as Haran and settled there. And the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Boy, that's a big shift in lifespan from the 800s and 900s down to the 200s. So now, in this next chapter, we're going to start to learn about Abram and how God dealt with him specifically and the promises that he made with Abram, later to be known as Abraham. One thing we can note is, this is stepping outside the basic, but I miss these things. There's a lot of things we miss when we read through the Bible. That's why we need to go back, reread, study, compare scriptures. But I had missed this, and one of the commentators pointed out that Abram married his half-sister, Sarai. If you go back and look at these genealogies and other scriptures, you'll see that he married his half-sister. Now, a marriage between close relatives was not forbidden until much later because the gene pool was still pure. The chances of mutations were remote. So he actually married his half-sister. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, this has been a tremendous event wrapped up in one short chapter. How not only the world was divided into languages, and now there are over 3,000 languages because those languages had offshoots into other languages over time. I don't know how many basic languages there were at the Tower of Babel, but there were enough to cause confusion. They had to stop the project. Everybody moved away. And this same chapter gives us the explanation of the origin of the different races. How from a single seed, all these races were developed after this dispersion because of the differences in language. So next time we're going to jump into the dealings of God with Abram and see what he has in store for Abram and eventually the nation of Israel and the rest of the world. Anyway, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you.